The goal of any VLP or Veterans Legacy Program field trip is to bring students into our national cemeteries. Our national cemeteries are sacred places, and we want students to understand that. And at the same time, we want them to learn. We want them to enjoy that activity in a way that remains respectful to those who are buried there. And we want them to understand that our cemeteries are places to visit, are places to learn stories about folks who made a difference in U.S. history in their local communities. We are honored to have our fourth grant with the National Cemetery Administration through the Veterans Legacy Program. We're happy to be back after COVID and working with the NCA and our partners in Washington and also locally at the cemeteries in Florida. And this year, our focus is training K-12 teachers to be able to do veterans research and to bring the veterans history that are in national cemeteries in Florida to their students. And we were excited to partner with a fourth grade class this year and be able to actually show teachers how that works, what that means in action, right? It was a public school from Orange County, Orlando Gifted Academy, and like all fourth grade classes around the state of Florida, they wanted to go to St. Augustine. Oftentimes the cemetery is not part of that tour, and so we were really pleased to work with a tour company locally in St. Augustine to be able to create a 1-hour portion of the tour for each of the two groups. The grade had 4 classes and were divided into 2 groups that did all of their activities.
Well, we had 2 groups of kids come in. We had them go through different stations. We had a station with Dr. Gannon where she explained about African Americans in World War I. Those children also were able to then learn about some of the physical objects. We had Catherine Thurlow coming around and showing them things like gas masks and helmets and some physical things that they could see up close. Then they went over to Dr. Giroux and Sarah Bousfield, where they learned about the Second Seminole Wars and the pyramids at the National Cemetery, and they learned to do some ledger art.
For us, we were really focused on trying to get fourth graders to have an understanding of the role of African Americans in World War I. Obviously, one of the big challenges with that is how do we determine what types of things they're going to understand? How do we make that relevant for those individuals who are obviously not the same level as us? So one of the things we had to really work with is trying to figure out how we take the academia that Dr. Gannon uses and convert it for something that the fourth graders can understand. So one of the things we really focused in on was using images, because obviously that's something anyone can relate to. So we really focused on using different photographs of African American soldiers from that time, so that the kids could look at them and ask questions while we talked about what was going on. I think that sometimes we get caught up in this idea that younger kids can't understand these more complex issues, when I don't think that's actually the case. I think it's just a matter of making it accessible to them and making it possible for them to relate to it. Because a lot of these kids are much more intuitive than we give them credit for, and they see these things out in the world. And especially with our population in Central Florida, we have such a diverse group of individuals who are part of this community. And so for them, getting to see people who maybe look like them or look like people they know, playing this really important, significant role in this war and this conflict is super important. So we set up some headstone rubbings for the kids, where we covered the headstones with this material so that the kids could then use what were basically giant crayons to rub on the headstones to get an image basically on the fabric of what the headstone looked like. And it was really cool because the kids were so excited and they had so many questions about who this person was and what they were doing, and they were able to get really, again, up close and personal with these individuals. And you could see those connections happening. Those kids were so excited about it.
It creates a connection between the person who is rubbing and the person whose headstone it represents in a very intimate way. I didn't realize how that would affect people who do it, particularly children. Children love hands-on, they love active, engaged learning, and it's the ultimate active, engaged learning. After they've listened to me pontificate and say things, they can actually make a connection with one person whose life was part of this larger historical event. But really, the most memorable thing was their reaction. We had brought uniforms out from the Military Museum in Kissimmee, and their reaction as they did the rubbings to the artifacts of history. And it made me think, well, if you would do a lot of fourth graders, we'd have pictures. But I really do think we had a World War I uniform, and so they could see it, and they even were allowed to touch it. And that was my favorite memory, their response to the artifacts we had on World War I.
So when we decided to do the field trip and the ledger art, I reached out to Gordon Yellowman, who is a peace chief with the Cheyenne tribe. He is a contemporary ledger artist. And I also talked with Noreen Starr, who works for the executive offices with the tribes. And Gordon actually gave me a base lesson plan for fourth graders based on ledger art. They wanted to make sure that Native American practices were embedded in that lesson. For instance, we had the children sit on the ground. The connection with Mother Earth was very important.
Looking back at the tradition with the Cheyenne Arapaho ledger art, they use colors of cultural and societal importance to them, taking that and then recording their perspectives and memories on ledger book papers. We thought that we could create an activity for students to engage in that same activity, creating something that they could take with them.
And the Native Americans that were brought to St. Augustine during, it was 3 periods. The Seminoles were imprisoned in St. Augustine, these Plains Indians were imprisoned there, and then the Apache were imprisoned there later. Not many Floridians know about it, and to get fourth graders at the stage that they are in school and what they're learning about, to learn about that, I think works really well. And the fact that they were able to take home the ledger art backpack along with the postcards that we did for them, it'll keep reinforcing that over time. There are 2 headstones in St. Augustine National Cemetery that have inscriptions that say 6 unknown Indians. So in theory, a total of 12. The right hand of these 2 contains the remains of 6 of the Plains Indian prisoners of war that were in St. Augustine from 1875 to 1878. There are 3 other burials of those prisoners elsewhere in the cemetery that were never located nor marked.
One of the things that we thought was a good way to do this was to introduce this tradition of coins, which dates back to the Romans, and certainly in Jewish tradition, leaving stones on the grave of a loved one is an important practice. This one was restarted during the Vietnam era in the United States in national cemeteries. A penny represents someone that you visited that you don't know but you want to pay your respects to. A nickel, boot camp, a dime served with, and a quarter means you were with that person when they passed away. And so we explain this tradition to the students, and we give them each a handful of pennies, and we ask them to pick any headstone in the cemetery before they go back to join their group and to go on to their next activity. And they have a quiet moment of reflection, and they say the name of the veteran out loud. And it's a really beautiful thing to see this many children that are 9 or 10 years old quietly walking around the cemetery, just pausing in front of the headstone of a veteran that they don't know, but whose name they've said.
When the children at the end of the field trip were putting pennies on headstones, there was a number of them that came up to the prisoner of war headstone to put pennies on it. And I had put a small sign in front of the headstone that listed the names of the 10 prisoners that we knew about. And they would crouch down and they would run their finger down the list until they found a name that they wanted to say. And then they would stand up and say the name and put the penny on the headstone. And that, yeah, it hits you.